Hey there, thanks for tuning into Duckbricks. I'm Chris, and today to celebrate the conclusion to this era of LEGO Ninjago, we will be taking a look at every single LEGO Ninjago Dragon they have ever made across the theme's over 10-year run. From the early dragons from the pilot seasons of 2011 all the way up to the Ultra Golden Dragon from season 15 Crystallized, there have been a lot of LEGO Ninjago Dragons, and I am so excited to showcase all of them for you. I think it's really cool because dragons are something that LEGO has been doing for a long time, and it's really interesting seeing the evolution of dragons from one particular theme. You can see some of the first LEGO dragons right here in 2011 with the pilot season, so we're going to start off with these dragons right here, and then we're going to make our way over to the dragon that we got for the Ultra Dragon all the way in 2012, so just 1 year later, we got a four-headed dragon, which has become a staple of LEGO Ninjago. Following that, we'll take a look at the Golden Dragon, move our way over to the rebooted dragon, so the Mech Dragon right here, and that was 2014. Going into 2015, we got some of our first dragons with fully brick-built heads with a big emphasis on brick-built detail with Zane's Titanium Dragon, and of course, we continued to get even more dragons throughout the multiple lines of Ninjago from there. Following tournament developments, we make our way over to Possession, where we have Morrow's Ghost Dragon and the Master Wu Dragon as well, two fantastic LEGO dragons and a lot of other ghost dragons beyond that. And of course, for Skybound, we got a majestic Lloyd Dragon, where you can see those beautiful wings right there in a very shiny metallic color, a very cool dragon to get. And of course, that was just the beginning. For Hands of Time, we got a Fusion Dragon for one of the first times with a Fusion Fire and Water Dragon for the blacksmith shop right there in the Hands of Time wave. And of course, the Ninjago movie gave us one of the best Ninjago dragons ever in the form of the Mech Dragon right here for the Lloyd set. After the Ninjago movie, dragons continue to come out, with Season 9 Hunted being focused on the dragon hunters in the first realm, coming out with Firstborn here, as well as an Earth Dragon and Lightning Dragon to complement the ranks. And of course, even in today's modern era with the more wild-brain version of LEGO, we are getting a lot more dragons. From the Season 13 Skull Sorcerer's Dragon Griefbringer here, to the small Wu's Battle Dragon, we've got a lot of great stuff, and even some original things, like the Ninjago Core Dragon for Lloyd, the legendary dragon, plus the Island Dragon, the Water Dragon, Zane's Evil Ice Dragon, and so much more, all culminating in this final Golden Ultra Dragon for Ninjago Crystallized, which some say is the best dragon set we've ever gotten, although I probably would have some other ideas in mind. Of course, there is so much history to go through here, 11 years and counting of LEGO Ninjago. I can't wait to jump into it, so let's start off right now. Alright, so here we are with every single LEGO Ninjago Dragon from 2011 all the way up to 2022. It has been 11 years and counting of LEGO Ninjago, and that has brought us a ton of different dragons. So the way that I'm going to kind of go through these is we'll take a look at each individual character one by one. We'll start off with Kai, then Jay, Zane, and Cole, of course the core 4 ninja, and then we'll go on to some of the other ones like Mia and of course Lloyd, and then we'll end with some of the villain dragons, which are scattered on either side of this whole collection here. And so, without further ado, I think we should start off with one of the most important ninja characters. This was the main character of the theme, at least when it started, of course, the Fire Dragons for Kai. So, as a quick caveat here, not every single one of these dragons is a fire dragon. And it's pretty interesting because, for example, the Firstborn Dragon here, which is basically probably the most important dragon that they ever released. This came out in 2019, at least story-wise, and was the mother of all dragons. So Firstborn has the power to use every single element. However, the set was designed, conceptualized, and sold as Kai's dragon. So if I had to imagine what happened, the story designers wanted this to have a more important role in the series rather than just another fire dragon that Kai encounters in the first realm, which is why they actually changed it around to become the most important first dragon of all. That being said, for a dragon that controls every single element, it is a little bit disappointing set-wise because obviously it is very clearly made to be just a fire dragon. So there was a bit of a misconnect between the story and the set design there. But beyond that, I think this is one of the coolest Ninjago Dragon sets. It's not one of the best ones, it's kind of average, but there are a lot of cool details to it. Pressing down on this lever on the back allows you to flap the wings. This again came out in the summer of 2018 for Season 9, the Firstborn Dragon here. And one of my favorite details is the brick-built head, which introduces a specialized printed component for each one of the eyes, which looks really good. This absolutely translated well to the screen as well as a physical brick build. So all in all, this is one of the best head sculpts for any one of the dragons. Of course, the ability to flap the wings by pressing this button is a very satisfying one. They just fall down due to gravity, although I do kind of wish that instead the wings were also mounted on ball joints. That is one of the things that a lot of the Ninjago Dragons are missing. If they have a function for the wings, they really aren't that posable because you basically just have to have them stuck out. If they're on ball joints, they don't have a function. So they haven't really incorporated two of each. It does also incorporate the swinging tail feature, which is common across most Ninjago Dragons. There are pros and cons to this. Obviously, it is fun to swing the tail, but in display, especially when sitting, it does tend to just wrap around the body and look kind of awkward, so pros and cons to that. Moving on though from Firstborn, I think we should talk about one of the first Ninjago Dragons ever. This is Kai's Fire Dragon from 2011's Summer Wave. This actually came as a two-part set packaged with the Fire Temple, which, if you don't know, was specifically built to split apart to reveal this dragon. This is basically one of the common dragon designs that they were using for the 2011 Golden Weapons Wave. If we kind of look at some of the other Ninja's dragons here, you've got the Lightning Dragon, and you've got the Ice Dragon over here, as well as Cole's Earth Dragon, and all of them share a lot of similar features, Cole's Earth Dragon being the most different one. But this is kind of the most vanilla dragon you could have gotten from Ninjago in 2011. Obviously, there are a lot of cons to this. This is not the most refined design, but it's honestly not too bad for what it was back in the day. The wings are mounted on ratchet joints, so not only can you flap them up and down, but you can also pivot them this way, which is a great way to introduce some poses. Unfortunately, you can't move them side to side like this because of the nature of the ball joint there being used, or because of the nature of the ratchet joint, but this actually introduced some specialized molded heads for the dragons. These are rubberized and are produced really well, and I know that these are fairly controversial. Some people love the molded heads, some people prefer brick built. For me, these have such a classic charm to them, and while they don't have many obvious LEGO connections, I think this absolutely set the unique aesthetic for what Ninjago Dragons would look like going into the future. One thing I love about these dragons is the fact that they also have a specialized Dragon Rider flag atop each of them. Every single one of the 2011 dragons did have a flag like that, and this is really where dragons all started in LEGO Ninjago to begin with. Speaking of that Fire Dragon, LEGO has actually remade that exact creature twice for Ninjago Legacy. The first one here was for a 4+ or junior set, so obviously it is a very, very simple design. It is really just a standard small dragon that set the precedent for what juniors dragons would look like. My favorite thing about this is easily the head mold. As you can see, they introduced a brand new plastic mold that is meant to mimic the older mold for the 2011 dragons, but this time you actually have stud connections in the mouth, so you can actually have fire or maybe a stud shooter inside if you wish, and it's just a lot more versatile of an element, as well as feeling like it keeps better in the LEGO system than the other element, which was a lot more rubberized and didn't really feel like a true LEGO element. That is probably the best part about this. I like the reuse of the Jurassic World LEGO dinosaur raptor legs here with some scales printed on the sides for the dragon legs themselves. That absolutely works at the scale, but there isn't really much else to say about this Junior's Dragon other than it's remarkably accurate to the original source material, right down to the exact color and style of the wings being in Keat Orange or Flame Yellowish Orange here, and overall just having a very similar look and feel, at least a miniaturized version of the original. Now, we did get a massive upgrade in 2020 when we got this massive Legacy Dragon. I believe this was actually 2021, my apologies. So this was 2021, the Legacy Fire Dragon. And in my opinion, this is one of the best Ninjago Dragons they have ever done. So the wings are fully cloth, which means that they actually have a feature where you can fold them inwards, which is really cool because you can actually get this in all sorts of different poses. When the wings are folded up, you can probably use him as crawling along the ground like this. You can really get all sorts of crazy poses, and this is probably one of the most interesting dragon designs we have gotten for Ninjago. The head sculpt is reusing the new head mold introduced for the 4+ set, which I think looks fantastic. And while this took a lot of liberties with the color scheme compared to the original, obviously the wings are completely different, being actually fabric elements and a different color, this is a lot more accurate to the TV show itself, which was kind of the point of Legacy, which was reimagining models in the form that they would be accurate to the television show. The dragon does retain its very long neck, which is a very characteristic part of this dragon in particular, but allows you to have a lot more articulation in general to get this in all sorts of fun poses, whether it's swooping down to catch prey or maybe kind of elongating the neck to soar outwards. This is just a really cool dragon in particular. Now, there are a few cons to this, and one of the major things is that, funnily enough, it retains one of the problems of the original model in that the feet are not able to be posed. They are fully fixed, so when you move the leg or just have them sit on the ground, the feet will just not sit straight because they're not on ball joints, they're on axles. And the same thing is done here where the feet are just basically fixed. You can't really angle the feet whatsoever. So that definitely feels like a bit of a miss to me. A lot of modern dragons mount these particular feet on ball joints, and I'm not really sure why they didn't do it here. But by far and away, the biggest problem with this set in particular is the way that the wings are attached. Now, as you can see, the dragon is supposed to be in flight like so. But let go of the wings for just a few seconds and they will just droop down. And that's because of the nature of the ratchet joints and the way that they weaken over time. When I first got the set, it was possible to splay this out for a few minutes, but then they will just tend to droop down. And of course, over time, this connection just becomes weaker and weaker. Comparing that to, say, ball joints, especially with friction joints that were introduced for the CCBS LEGO Hero Factory and Bionicle line, these are not going to droop down anytime soon. And yeah, obviously these wings are a lot less complicated than these, but especially if you're using the friction joint, it would have been really, really hard to actually get these to bend out of shape. Not to mention that if they used a ball joint with friction here, you could have actually angled the wings in different positions. All in all, that feels like a big miss to me. Thankfully, it is very, very easy to modify this to incorporate that. They literally have specific ball and socket joints with this exact dimensions. So probably after this review, I will be modifying it myself to actually make the wings to be able to be posed more easily. Because as soon as I let go of my fingers underneath the wings, they will droop down like so. And that's not a great position to have. Moving on from the Legacy Fire Dragon, we can take a look at some of the smallest fire dragons. This one in particular was one introduced for Ninjago Core, which is kind of a mix between the Juniors 4+ stuff, but not quite the mainline Ninjago sets. They specifically are aimed for 5+ kids. So Core introduced, which was this year in 2022, an interesting building mechanism where you could level up different creatures and builds. So the way that this is supposed to work is that the dragon is built in modules, and you can either have a smaller creature like so you have a much smaller kind of animal right here, then you can get a different body section and build it outwards. It's a very similar system to how LEGO actually did a lot of their classic spaceships back in the day, which is pretty interesting, and I think it's a pretty cool design, having kids be able to, say, take certain segments of the wings off, so then you can have a much smaller dragon with kind of smaller wings, and then add on different segments of the cool dual molded wing elements. Unfortunately, though, that does come with a lot of restrictions because obviously the wings are basically just fixed here on a joint. You can't really move the back legs back and forth too much because of the placement of the ball joints here. And all in all, this does feel very juniorized compared to the others. The brand new plastic mold introduced for the head also is not one of my favorites. I like the front part because the top part actually can be used if printed well in realistic conditions. The bottom jaw just feels a little bit too blocky and juniorized to me. I'm not the biggest fan of this, and I would have been fine if they kept it to the core line with the younger kids focus, but they have been introducing this jaw in some of the other mainline Ninjago Dragons, which just feels a little bit out of place compared to the rest of the detailing. Finally, there is one more polybag for Kai's Elemental Dragon. It's pretty interesting because we never actually got an Elemental Dragon for Kai despite him using it throughout seasons 4 to 7, so they kind of tried to make up for it in a polybag. I do also want to note that there are other polybag dragons. I'm not going to be reviewing every single one, especially because I don't have all the polybags built right now, but this is just an example of what you could have gotten in a small little polybag for Ninjago released around 2019, using Kai in kind of a mismatched suit that combined his Sons of Garmadon Season 8 outfit with the Legacy head wrap. So kind of an odd minifigure, just a small brick-built dragon that you can kind of play around with. But with that, we have summed up all of the Kai exclusive dragons. But I feel like now is a good transition point because we actually got a couple of fusion dragons for Kai and Nia. So this is the Fusion Fire and Water Dragon. This was released in 2017 for Season 7, The Hands of Time, and it introduces one of the most interesting concepts of Ninjago, which is two elemental masters creating a fusion between two dragons. Now, unfortunately, they didn't really mess around with this concept too much. They did a fusion dragon for Jay and Nia, but it was marketed as a Jade Dragon and didn't really have anything to do with Nia. So this was really the only true fusion dragon we got from Ninjago, and it certainly is an interesting one. While the head sculpts are not my favorite, they do seem just very blocky and simple to me. Not the biggest fan of the way the heads turned out. The concept of the dragon itself is really interesting. And one of my favorite details are the scales on the back actually reflecting the medium azure and red color scheme kind of striping together. You can see that there's a blue stripe that goes on this side and a red stripe that goes through the other side. All in all, it's just a really interesting design, and I love how they really committed to the fusion aspect, with literally half of the dragon being a water dragon. So you've got the blue claws here, some blue detailing on this side, and then you have the exact same build but in red for the other side with some of the transparent orange claws, the transparent orange wings and whatnot. And all in all, this is probably the most they actually ever committed to making a fusion dragon. So it's a really interesting concept to me. Not one of my favorite dragons. I think it's kind of simple and blocky. This actually came as part of a much larger set that incorporated a dragon's forge. So obviously a lot of bricks went into making that too. But I think I like it because it's an interesting concept that I wish they did more in Ninjago. Now, funnily enough, while it wasn't marketed as such, we did basically get this exact dragon or a very similar fusion dragon between Kai and Nia just this year in 2022 with the Ninjago core line. This is basically a fusion dragon between Kai and Nia. As you can see, it's using a red and blue mix. I don't think it's supposed to be the same dragon, but it basically is the same concept. It's an interesting one because you're using the wing pieces that were used for LEGO Elves and also the LEGO Harry Potter Thestrals, which haven't really been seen in Ninjago. They're very reminiscent of the original LEGO Castle Dragon wings, except at a much smaller scale. And this is basically just a very similar dragon to the Kai's Fire Dragon, just even smaller because the wings themselves are just much smaller. Now, obviously, this is reusing a lot of parts like the lower jaw and the legs themselves, and I figure that they made it a fusion dragon because they could reuse the parts and save on budget, but it's just kind of interesting seeing another fusion dragon come so late in the game. And speaking of Nia dragons, we only have one water dragon as compared to Kai's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, technically 6 sets. Kai gets 6, Nia unfortunately only gets 1 because she became a ninja rather late in the game, and Nia's sets aren't typically big sellers, so LEGO doesn't focus on them too much. However, for Ninjago Skybound, Nia was the main character, and she finally got a water dragon of her own. And this is a really interesting one with a lot of pros and a lot of cons. So this function is quite cool because you can actually press a button on the top of it to allow the wings to kind of flap almost in a butterfly-like configuration. These are very strange wings for a dragon in particular. They don't really look like your traditional dragon wings, but they certainly do the trick for some sort of elemental-like dragon. Now, the way this appeared in the show was really interesting because it was a transparent blue dragon with a massive wingspan, and they didn't really go for that for the set. It kind of just has a strange wing flapping function where I'm not really sure what to make of it. I almost can see this almost like a dragonfly or a butterfly hovering instead of an actual dragon wing element, but they tried to do something different, and it does show. This does have the very long tail flapping function, which you can see here, which again, unfortunately, does tend to curl up very awkwardly when it's on the ground, so I definitely would have preferred maybe having a ball-jointed tail instead. That being said, I do appreciate a lot of the details like the flippers being used. These are actually the scuba diver flippers being used along the side of the dragon itself to add some scaling detail, and the head actually is not too bad. It is using some of the newer molded elements, and it definitely does feel a little bit too simplistic with just the battle droid arms being used to connect them, but the shaping's nice, and I do like the printing quite a lot and how the printing translates to the sticker on top of the head as well. All in all, this is a good attempt for a water dragon for Nia. It is very long. It's easily one of the longest Ninjago dragons in the way that it's made. I just feel like it could have been just a little bit better. Just give it extra wings, make the wingspan a little bit more impressive, and maybe cut down on the joints for the tail, and I would have been much happier with the water dragon. Alright, so moving on, we have Jade Dragons, and for these I'm going to go chronologically because I think that's the easiest way to explain them. The Jade Dragon that we got, that is the largest one, was also the first. Released in 2011 Summer Wave, this is probably the best of the pilot era dragons because it just has so much articulation. This is easily, I think, one of the coolest dragons that really holds up to this day. You can articulate it kind of like a long lizard-like creature on the side here. You also can rotate different body segments, so you can have a more realistic flight pattern and really just rotate up the inner body like so. The tail is jointed on different joints here. Would have been nice to use ball joints, but obviously this came out before mixel joints were even invented, so they probably would have done that today, but nowadays they just did these standard click joints. The wings themselves have a surprisingly high degree of articulation for being mounted on ratchet joints. You can splay them back and forth, up and down, rotate them, and up and down on a different joint. So you can really get a realistic flow of moving here, and I think this is probably the most impressive articulation they have ever achieved with ratchet joints by just getting it in all sorts of different poses. Of course, you can fold up and splay out the wings, so that is really cool because you can also get it in a folded up pose like so. And all in all, this easily probably is the gold standard for this style of Ninjago Dragon, despite it coming out so many years ago. Moving on, there's even more articulation in the head where you can actually move the upper neck here from side to side and rotate it with Jay seated right there. And you of course have the head mounted on a ball joint as well, so this just has an insane amount of articulation. Not to mention the legs actually mounted on ball joints with the feet individually mounted, so you could actually pose this up in pretty much any way you want. I have very little to complain about this dragon because I do feel that it is easily the best out of the pilot era dragons. It definitely has a very unique look and feel and sets itself apart from the other dragons because it of course has a much longer silhouette. The wings have a much wider wingspan just because of this extra joint right here, and surprisingly, because the wings are not super heavy, the ratchet joints actually keep up. Sure, they will fall after rigorous flapping, but it's nothing like the other Kai Dragon where the wings just don't stay up at all. These really do stay up, and it is so satisfying to swoosh this and get this into all sorts of really interesting poses, especially when you're flying in midair and you want to have maybe the torso twisting like so. You can really get this into all sorts of great poses like this, and all in all, this is probably one of my favorite Ninjago Dragons ever. There's a reason why this is one of the rarer Ninjago sets, and that's because this had a very limited release as a Toys R Us exclusive in the US back in 2011, and this is definitely the best one of the early Dragons. From there, the next Jade Dragon we got was, in story, a fusion dragon between Jay and Nia. This came out in 2016 for Season 6 Skybound, although unfortunately, it was basically marketed as just a Jade Dragon. If you look at the markings, it uses Jay's symbol. There's lightning on all of the wings, and there is literally nothing that suggests it is a water dragon, so it definitely is kind of an afterthought that they made this a fusion dragon in the show itself. It did service the story quite well, having them create a fusion dragon at that pivotal moment, but as far as the set is concerned, this is just another lightning dragon. Now, the wings are mounted on mixel ball joints, which is fine because the wings are not super impressive. They're just very, very simple. I actually do really like the head, and this uses some pretty cool parts usages. If you notice, the bottom jaw is using Metalbeard's beard from the LEGO movie, recolored in dark blue. That is a really surprising parts usage and one that I would not have expected them to recolor for just this one-off use. Now, unfortunately, when prototypes of the set came out, the head design was even better than this. Instead of just having a simple brick-built front, they reused the LEGO Hero Factory Beast jumper piece to form kind of a jaw, snout, and nostrils on the front of the dragon, which looked fantastic. It was an ingenious use of that piece, and for whatever reason, they decided not to include it. Maybe because the jumper mold was already being retired by 2016. I don't really know what the logic was in not including that, but I certainly kind of wish that they did stick with that initial design, because that paired with the recolor of the Metalbeard beard in dark blue probably would have made this a contender for one of the best looking Ninjago Dragon custom head sculpts, instead of just having a pretty interesting parts usage for the jaw and a fairly basic top of the head. Otherwise, there's not too much else to say about this. It's just kind of a standard mid-sized Ninjago Dragon, and because it didn't incorporate the really cool parts usage on the front, nothing really makes this stand out. Moving over from 2016, in 2018 we got a Lightning Dragon for Jade that was a wild variant of the creature. This was the Stormbringer Dragon, and specifically this was in the first realm. It was initially a wild dragon before it was tamed. I have made some custom modifications to this myself because initially the wings, to be honest, were not super impressive. They basically just had a single one of these flaps just sticking out of the sides. So what I've done is I've added on some custom details myself, like adding on these Nexonites pieces as wing scales. I've also redesigned the way that the legs work on these back here to add some scales to the back, and I've basically also beefed it up in general. But all in all, this is kind of an interesting dragon. I like the color scheme because you have a keyed orange or flame yellowish orange body down below, which kind of suggests the electricity or lightning nature, and transitioning upwards to regular blue up to metru or dark blue. But all in all, I think the most awkward thing about this is the head sculpt. He has a very large bottom of the jaw here, and the reason for that is because this was developed in tandem with LEGO Boost, which was their reimagining of LEGO Mindstorms. You could actually hook this up to a controllable battery box and cause the head to fire missiles and move around and whatnot, but all of that meant that this dragon just ended up feeling a little bit strange, and especially the head was quite blocky. I do like the interesting design to actually have the wings be able to have a non-traditional design for a dragon, just kind of having two smaller slits along these sides. But all in all, this is not one of my favorite dragons. I like the color scheme, but I think a lot more could have been done for a lightning dragon. Moving onwards to 2020, we have the Prime Empire Digital Jade Dragon. Now this one I really do like, and this incorporates a really interesting feature where you can move the body side to side, but that does not affect the launching of spring-loaded missiles. So even when the body is curved all the way to one particular side, you can press this very hidden away Technic axle on the front, and missiles will fire. What's also really cool is that the missiles do not both fire all at once. They are a little bit staggered in there. And that is a really cool design to me because it's awesome that you can actually point where you want the missiles to fire and they will go in the direction you're pointing. Now, this also incorporates a lot of really cool technological aspects to the design. The feet are actually LEGO Technic cable attachment points. These are used for cable management in larger Technic sets with lots of wires and electronics, and they use them as toes for the dragon, which is doubly cool because they look like toes, but it also fits that technological aspect for Prime Empire, which I think is really cool. You've got all sorts of interesting details on the dragon itself, from the transparent neon orange knife elements being used as the jaw. The head isn't super impressive, but my favorite building technique has to be the usage of the LEGO R2-D2 legs, recolored in blue to form the side of the dragon. That is a great parts usage and one that really feeds into the technological or digital design. And of course, the wings themselves are kind of reminiscent of some of the stuff like the Mech Dragon and Lloyd's Mech Dragon, but you've got massive booster engines on the sides of the wings right here. And of course, they were using the new Prime Empire blade element, which just looks really cool and does allow you to pose up the wings themselves. I just wish that they maybe managed to include one more of these wing elements to really make it stand out. If they had it like this, I definitely would have been a lot happier with the wing design. I think that would have felt more complete. But instead they just had two blades on each of the wings, and if there's something to complain about, it is that. Otherwise, this is easily one of my favorite Ninjago dragons. I love the technological design, and the color scheme is really cool as well, with the black bottom, the kind of sides being made up of standard blue, and the light azure being used for the top. But moving on from that, we just have one more dragon for Jay. This is another one of the 2022 core lightning dragons. So as you can see here, it's made so you can split up the body in different components. So you can kind of detach the middle piece, combine the two smaller pieces here, kind of change the look and feel of the dragon itself. And it's an interesting concept that I feel like probably could have worked better for other different LEGO models, but this is just super juniorized to me. And I understand that I am not the target audience for, well, many of these sets, but specifically I'm not the target audience, certainly for a build like this. I like it for what it is. The dual molded headpiece, which they introduced this year, is pretty interesting, allowing it to have a transparent yellow top and azure bottom. Still don't like the bottom jaw piece being used here that much still feels a little bit juniorized, but everything else is not too bad. And despite this being cheaper than Kai's Dragon, I feel like I kind of like it better. It just feels a little bit more cohesive to me, and I like the fact that you can actually pose up the wings in different positions, rather than the Kai's Fire Dragon from Core having them at a very awkward angle pointing forwards right here. But with that, we can move on to the next ninja. We're going to skip over Lloyd for a little bit and handle all of his dragons last because he has a ton of them, and focus in on some of the other ninja. So Zane has gotten 3 dragons to date. However, next year for Ninjago Core, we are getting a massive ice dragon, so I can't wait to get that. But as of right now, as of filming this in 2022, Zane only has 3 dragons. The first one here was the very first dragon we ever got for LEGO Ninjago, because this was introduced in the winter wave of Ninjago. Most of the other dragons came out in the summer wave, but this was the first one we got, and by consequence, it is the smallest and most simple of all the dragons. It has a very simple build for the underside right here. It's just a super simple construction of just stacking blocks together. There are only 3 wing elements instead of 4 like the lightning and fire dragons, and you can flap the wings up and down, but you have to mount it on this particular joint. So it does feel a little bit awkward to flap the wings here. These also rotate, which is nice articulation, but because you can't actually move this piece, you can't really do much with that particular point of articulation, and oftentimes it just ends up getting annoying because, especially over time, they'll just flop around and get out of place. So it's kind of a mixed bag. I do really like the addition of orange into the color scheme though. I think that was an excellent choice, having orange be a highlight color here for the tips of the claws being introduced in just some aspects of the wings. There are a couple little orange studs being worked into the dragon itself. I think it's an interesting highlight color that they haven't really explored for Zane ever again. All in all, by all of these specialized rubber molded heads, I think this is my favorite one just because of the detailing of it. It just looks really cool, albeit a little bit oversized for this particular style of dragon. With that though, we can now move on to Zane's next dragon. In 2015, for the Tournament of Elements, we got our first Elemental Dragon for Zane, and this was one of the first times they were experimenting with a fully brick-built head for one of the Ninja Dragons. From the top, it honestly looks kind of awkward. I'm not the biggest fan of how it looks from the top. From the sides, it looks pretty cool. I actually do like how it looks from the sides, so it only looks good at certain angles and different parts of the way you want to see it, but it was a good start for what would eventually become the norm for Ninjago Dragons during its time. Now, this is very interesting because it does incorporate a ball joint on the inside of the dragon itself, which I think is a very cool detail to be able to add a lot of excess articulation. And of course, it has a very silver metallic look for the titanium ninja, so you've got some very long upper legs, which definitely gives it a very unique aesthetic look and feel. These can of course be bent backwards for a flying position, and I actually really do like the way the wings work here because these particular joints are mounted on ratchet joints. So that means you can have them be folded flat, you can maybe fold them down for a slightly different look and feel for the dragon itself, or you can fold them upwards. So you can actually have them folded upwards like it's moving the wings up like so. All in all, this is a really cool look for this particular dragon, and I do actually like the way the wings came out, which is surprising because I typically like fabric and cloth wings more, but the ability to actually pose these in different arrangements is very cool to me. Just look at how different it looks having the wings being pointed up here and being pointed down here, and it really allows for super dynamic posing that I kind of wish they incorporated with future dragons past this one. Moving on from this elemental dragon though, we can take a look at Zane's next dragon, and this one is also very interesting because this is actually the dragon of the Ice Emperor, Boreal. So Boreal has existed for hundreds of years because Zane was actually sent back into the past for the Netherrealm. So he made Boreal while he was under the influence of Forbidden Spinjitzu, making this kind of a more evil dragon. This dragon was actually the main antagonist for one of the main threats throughout the second half of Season 11, with Zane commanding it to attack the ninja and terrorize the civilians when he was under the Ice Emperor persona. So kind of interesting how Zane's third dragon is actually a full-on villain dragon, but This is really cool because it does look like it has been sculpted out of pure ice. As we revealed at the end of the season, Kai was able to actually melt down this dragon completely with a massive burst of fire. So it's really cool how this really does feel like it is made out of ice. I love the vinyl wing element, and while sometimes the vinyl elements do tend to end up feeling a little bit cheap, this is pretty much perfect because you want to have transparent wings for a dragon like this that's made out of ice. And the wings being as large as they are and as satisfying to flap is really fun. And this is easily my favorite Zane dragon, despite it being a villainous one. I also like how if you zoom in on the toes themselves, he has little ice spikes for each of the toes of the dragon here. So really cool how you can get a different amount of articulation even on the toes themselves, which is very cool using the Hero Factory Beast Foot element. And of course the head, while being very simple, this is probably the most simple and compact head we've gotten, is surprisingly really good for what it is and really conveys the menace of the Ice Emperor's dragon all in all, because it has a very long neck. You can really angle this up and down in different positions, and the head is just a really cool one to look at. All in all, big fan of the way this dragon turned out, and it's definitely one of the best Ninjago dragons out there, despite actually being packaged with the Fortress, which obviously was the focus of the set, and this was really just a side build in a much larger set. Moving on from that, we can take a look now at the 3 dragons that Cole has gotten. So similar to Zane, Cole has only gotten 3 dragons. Technically only 2 that expressly belong to him, but the first one we got was in the summer wave of 2011. This is the very first Cole's Earth Dragon, and consequently the most different and unique out of all of the 2011 pilot dragons. Instead of featuring the large wings, Cole's dragon does not have wings at all. This was probably intended to be more of a rock-like Earth Dragon creature, although obviously for the actual episodes themselves they just kind of added wings onto it. So this I definitely feel needed a Legacy remake. It is a shame that we didn't get one for Legacy before the theme ended, but I really do feel like this particular dragon could have been a lot more improved by having wings, although it is a cool design to actually not have wings on a dragon and instead have it be more of a lizard-like creature. They actually introduced a brand new head sculpt for Cole's dragon, which was the only one that was different from the rest of the Ninja Dragons in 2011. It is a much larger and bulkier element that was actually reused for the Golden Dragon, so it is quite interesting to see this particular head sculpt being used for this model. Now, the front legs are mounted on ball joints, which is very nice because you can pose them up. Unfortunately, the back legs cannot be moved at all. Only the feet can be moved, but you can't actually bend the back legs. They are mounted on Technic axles, so I think that is a bit of a miss. And of course, you do have the swinging tail feature, which kind of set the precedent for Ninjago Dragons, plus the ability to pivot the dragon waist like this, which is a nice one. I think my favorite feature of this dragon is the frill-like attachment it has here. It really does feel like a Komodo dragon or some sort of a lizard rather than a traditional dragon, and this just gives it a very unique identity for itself. Moving on from 2011, it's been quite a while before we got another dragon because this was the next one we got. It was just a little mini set for Skybound in 2016. This is supposed to be Cole's Elemental Dragon. It obviously is just a really little guy right here and definitely doesn't really signify what Cole's Elemental Dragon looks like at all in the show. I really do feel like this is kind of a missed opportunity to give us an actual Cole's Elemental Dragon. Now that being said, this is a very cute and small creature. Obviously didn't really appear in Skybound, but I guess they just kind of had to have a filler set here, so they made a small dragon for Cole and just called it his Elemental Dragon. It's just interesting how they made this, and it never really featured in the show as a different creature. Obviously they just kind of scaled down what was supposed to be his standard dragon. I like the sand green highlights though, that returning for Cole's secondary color scheme there, but honestly, not much else to say about this very small dragon that, if scaled down even more, could have been a polybag. And finally, moving on, in 2018, we got an Earth Dragon that wasn't even really tied to Cole. This started off as an antagonist in the first realm where the ninja were forced to battle it in an arena before Cole eventually flew it as an Earth Dragon just in the final episodes of the season. I do like the inclusion of the Sons of Garmadon blade elements as the wings here, although they do feel a little bit too mechanical and awkward for this particular dragon. You can move the wings on ball joints, which is nice, but it doesn't really have large or impressive wings. They're just really small ones here. You also can move the legs back and forth on ratchet joints, and I like the inclusion of very large claws on the front here. I think it's pretty cool that the claws are actually fully brick built, so you have large claws being used on the front of the dragon, and of course a large club-like tail that is mounted on mixel joints, which is very, very cool as well, because that absolutely gives it a whole unique identity. All in all though, this is kind of just a standard dragon. I like how they were doing unique and different things with the First Realm dragons, but this one isn't super impressive, and I kind of prefer what they did with some of the other ones. But with all of the core ninja summarized, it's time to wrap things up with the hero dragons for the ninja and take a look at the Lloyd Dragons, of which there have been many. And for the Lloyd Dragons, I am also roping in the Jungle Dragon because while it wasn't explicitly a Lloyd creature, it spent the most time with Lloyd in the show itself and was marketed with Lloyd riding it, and it's kind of greenish, it's teal, so I'm throwing him in too. But all in all, we have gotten a ton of Lloyd Dragons, and the first one was the Ultra Dragon from 2012. Now this is a really cool one because it introduced the concept of a four-headed dragon. The wing flapping function is interesting because you basically just hold it by the handle and swing it back and forth to allow you to flap the wings, which is pretty fun and satisfying, and it does stay together, but it also means that the wings can't really be positioned. If you want it in flight, these are more vertical, and I feel like it would have been cooler to have the wings be mounted on a more horizontal spread to actually make them feel like movable wings. It is a bit of a con for this dragon because when folded up, this looks fantastic. But then when splayed out, it almost looks like it's a vertical mane or kind of a frill instead of wings themselves. Moving on to the back, it has a very spiky tail, and while I'm not typically a big fan of the frictionless moving tails, I think this is probably the best one because you can really see how bulky it is and you can get it whipped up in a frenzy like so, and it does actually have these kind of side spike pieces to allow you to actually be able to not have the tail really curl up in one angle. The four heads are very interesting going with the white color scheme. I always found it interesting how this dragon was a predominantly white colored creature instead of green for the Green Ninja, but I guess it kind of makes sense as it's kind of an amalgamation of all the different elements. You have basically recolors of all of the 2011 pilot dragons in white, which is a very cool thing to get here for each of the dragons. And of course, they each had a different colored Zammer sphere or energy sphere that they could use to fire off, which is very cool as well. All in all, this was an interesting start for the Ultra Dragon and a four-headed creature. I know when it first came out, there were a lot of complaints that it didn't really look great and the four heads seemed very awkward, but it was an interesting start for what would become the norm for four-headed Ninjago Dragons. Moving forwards many years, I want to kind of take a look at the legacy version of the Ultra Dragon, and the thing that I find most interesting about this is that this is probably one of the most faithful legacy sets they ever made, at least in terms of the original set. Right down to the flapping wing mechanism being very similar, despite being built out of completely different pieces. For this dragon, they used a vinyl wing element, which I think is pretty cool. I think it could have even been larger, but this is nice. I just feel like I really wish that they, instead of having this feature, just had an actual standard wing feature so you could actually pose this up and flap the wings in a more realistic manner, rather than just keeping many of the flaws of the original design. One thing I do like better is the fact that the heads actually are fully spaced out here. Instead of having the heads just all mounted right on the same point, as you can see as we look down here, each of the heads has its own mount. You have a little bit of an in-between piece for the heads themselves, and what's very cool is that the heads are not only all brick built, so they all have their own unique expression and identity, but they also have stud shooters mounted on the side, so you retain each head firing a different aspect of the elements, which was a feature of the original set. Comparing this to the original right here, I do find it interesting how the placement of a couple of the heads is moved. Maybe I've gotten one of them wrong. I need to double check, and I'm sure that that was not intentional, but as you can see that the heads are pretty much laid out in the same configuration, it just feels a lot more natural with the legacy version because obviously the heads have their own positions. I also appreciate how a lot more elements were used for the scaling and back of this particular dragon for Legacy. They really did improve the way this works, and despite having obviously the same tail swinging feature, this just feels a lot more bulky and built up. All in all, my only real complaint about this is that you cannot move the legs. These legs are fixed, and obviously they wanted to fix them because they wanted the function to work like that, but you can't move these whatsoever. You can only move the foot itself, which makes flying positions for this creature very awkward. You can't even move the back legs for whatever reason, so these are fully fixed as well. So that feels like a big disappointment to me, just not being able to move these whatsoever. But speaking of four-headed dragons, it's time we look now to the most recent Ninjago Dragon we have gotten, setting aside the regular Ultra Dragons. This is the Ninjago Crystallized 2022 Golden Ultra Dragon. It is a very similar concept of combining all four core elements of fire, lightning, earth, and ice into one dragon, having it have four heads, but in all gold, which is really interesting. Now, at the time of this recording, Ninjago Crystallized has not finished airing. In fact, I believe that the time the video releases, it probably airs tomorrow. So if it hasn't aired already, I do not know the context behind this. I can make a couple of guesses based on where the season is going, but my guess is as good as yours. By the time you're watching this, though, you may already know the story significance of this model. If I had to guess, this is a combination of the ninja's dragon forms. Maybe they make a sacrifice and transform into this. I don't know what the deal is, but just looking at this as a model, I think it's pretty interesting. There are a lot of pros and there are a good amount of cons, and I did discuss this in depth in its own review for the Crystallized Mech review, so I'll try to share my thoughts pretty briefly here. I like that you can pivot the body back and forth, and of course this is taking great advantage of the brand new joint introduced for 2022 to allow large mechs to be fully posed, so you can actually move the limbs back and forth, which is really great. Now, sometimes the movement, as you can see, can cause some pieces to get knocked off, but for the most part, it is pretty stable and solid, which is quite nice. Now, the wings have an interesting mechanism that I find quite nice. You actually can twist this right here, which is a rubber wheel that actually causes the gear to move the wings back and forth. I'm not sure why stuff is falling apart on me here, but as you can see, that is the way the function is supposed to work. So you just twist it back and forth and the wings will flap. Personally, for the last Ninjago Dragon for this particular era, I would have loved to see something like cloth wings or vinyl wings, but these aren't too bad. It's just unfortunate that the biggest problem with the set is that you cannot move these. Since they actually wanted to make the function easy for kids to use and twist themselves, they decided to make the wings fully fixed. Now obviously this can be changed by just the introduction of a couple of ball joints here, but it feels like a major missed opportunity to not be able to flap the wings whatsoever, resulting in the dragon feeling rather static when you pose it. Now that being said, I love the shaping of the body itself. If you look here, they used a lot of great curved elements to really form the chest of the dragon itself, making it have a very large and broad chest right here, which leads all the way up to the different heads. And speaking of the heads, so the heads are using the specialized core elements, which, as I mentioned before, do feel a little bit too juniorized to me. I think the ones that suffered the most are the Earth Dragon heads, which is using the very simplified jaw element just up and down here, which feels very awkward to me. And of course, the Ice Dragon head, which is using this large lower jaw here, which just feels kind of strange. Not really sure if I'm the biggest fan of the way these pieces worked out, and I would have much preferred it if they actually used the building technique that they used earlier this year for Lloyd's Legendary Dragon, which is a great transition over to this one. So as you can see here, Lloyd's Legendary Dragon is using many of the same exact molded elements, but instead of just having them attached by battle droid arms, they actually fully built a brick-built head right here behind it, and then just used the molded elements at the front. This to me is probably the perfect dragon head. I think this is probably the best dragon head we have ever gotten from any one of these animals. I love the perfect blend between the molded pieces as well as the brick-built components. And to me personally, I think that all dragons for Ninjago should do something like this. It is so realistic and satisfying to move up and down. It feels very filled out and feels very solid as a build, as compared to, say, the Golden Ultra Dragon right here, which, as you can see, just uses bracket pieces to attach the jaws, so it just feels very robotic and skeletal, and it feels that the heads just kind of start at a particular point and just stop, and of course you can get the jaw accidentally pulled all the way out like so. Just a lot of awkward things can happen with this particular arrangement. All of that is fixed by Lloyd's Legendary Dragon, which actually came out before the Golden Ultra Dragon earlier this year, so that's kind of interesting. One other thing I love about this dragon is the wing flapping feature, because as you can see here, you just twist a bar and the wings just flap on mixel joints, which is quite interesting. And despite the fact that you can't actually have the wings move up and down, I think this is probably one of the best wing flapping mechanisms we have ever gotten, just because of how satisfying it is to move back and forth. You really just kind of twist this bar and the wings pivot side to side. Of course, it would have been really nice if these were also mounted on ball joints, but I definitely can see how that would have maybe messed around with stability of the actual model itself, so I understand why they did not do that. Just feels nice to be able to move this back and forth. Now, moving on from that, the tail itself is mounted on mixel joints, which means that you don't have the overly flapping issue that a lot of the other dragons have. And of course, much like the Golden Dragon, you can move the limbs back and forth on the brand new 2022 ratchet joint that they introduced for mechs. Now, I love the way that the front of the dragon is built as well, using these very large curvature pieces, kind of similar to the Golden Dragon, but honestly feeling even more streamlined here. And I think that this is probably the better dragon in my opinion, despite the Golden Ultra Dragon being really impressive with metallic gold pieces and having probably a very pivotal story component. This is probably the better build in my opinion. But moving on from that, we can now go back in time to some of the other dragons. In 2021, last year, we got the Jungle Dragon, which again wasn't specific to Lloyd. It kind of just is a creature on the island, but I kind of felt like it made sense to group him in here. I love the color scheme of this dragon. It's the first time we've gotten a teal dragon, and probably one of the only times we've gotten a teal focus set in general. Teal, if you aren't aware, was actually discontinued back in 2008 before being brought back around 2016, so it was an older LEGO color, was retired for many years, and they finally brought it back, and it's been used in a lot of applications since. And for being such a small creature with just kind of small vestiges of wings and whatnot, this is just a really satisfying creature to build and look at just because of that cohesive color scheme. I also think that the tail feature is probably the best that the frictionless tail wag has been implemented in any other dragon, because they specifically built this out of unique technic elements which allow you to actually be able to curve the tail but not have it curve over way too much, keeping the thin tail look but also allowing you to wag the tail, much like the character did in the TV show itself. And it's very satisfying to have the tail flip back and forth like so. The head itself is a really fun and goofy one with a specialized print on the side of the eye. It's actually asymmetrical, so one side is a little bit more serious and the other side is clearly having quite a lot of fun. And of course, you've got a lot of great teal recolors for this dragon in particular, a lot of pieces that were introduced in teal for this creature, which is fantastic to see. And I don't even mind the wings just being very skeletal here, because it definitely fits with the Jungle Dragon aesthetic, and we didn't really even see this flying too much. It just kind of walked along the ground and jumped, so I think that makes a lot more sense to me. So overall, quite a solid dragon build, especially a better one for the small size, probably one of the best smaller dragons. And speaking of smaller dragons, before we move on to the two larger Lloyd Dragons, I think we should talk about the two Golden Dragons. So this first Golden Dragon was released in 2013 for the Final Battle series and was basically going to be the final Ninjago Dragon, and this is the Legacy version released in 2019. And there are a lot of similarities between them. Obviously the Legacy version is a lot smaller, but in my opinion, the better build. This, to be honest, is probably one of the more disappointing Ninjago Dragons, especially because it just felt really rushed. You can't move the legs and feet whatsoever other than the one joint, so you can't really get it in a good standing pose. The wings definitely feel like kind of just returning to the Zane's Ice Dragon system. In fact, if you bring that one over here, they basically are built exactly the same way. These are very, very similar sets. The wings are done in almost the same manner, and it really shows because this was not one of my favorite ways to set up wings. There just feels like the pivot movement on the point attachment for the wings just isn't in the right place, and being able to only flap it on this joint is not fantastic. It was really cool getting a Golden Dragon back in 2013 with a specialized new Golden Dragon head sculpt right here. This is a recolor of the Earth Dragon head sculpt, but they made it with new printing and in gold. But overall, just a little disappointing for the final dragon to be used by the Golden Ninja. And definitely the new Golden Ultra Dragon for Crystallized is a lot more impressive than this. But moving on, I actually do really appreciate the Legacy version. It took a lot of what I did not like about the original version and just kind of shrunk it down to make it feel a lot better as a dragon creature itself. The scale is actually pretty accurate to the TV show, so that I do appreciate. And they also introduced this brand new head mold for the top piece to allow you to actually be able to open and close the jaw. And what's really cool is you can bite down and shoot out of the stud shooter in the mouth there because it has the stud attachment. So that is fantastic to see. I like the less rubbery and more plastic or solid plastic feel of this. Of course, you have a lot of articulation around the head, and because this is just using mixel joints, you actually do have a full range of motion for the wings themselves to really flap, which I think is really fantastic. Now, of course, there was actually one more Golden Dragon over here at our LEGO Dimensions display, which was the Toys to Life video game. Ninjago had quite a feature for the game itself, featuring all of the core characters from Lloyd, Kai, Jay, Zane, Cole, Master Wu, and Nia as Samurai X, so we got a ton of Dimensions characters, but most importantly, we did get micro builds of two of the dragons out there, one of which being Lloyd's Golden Dragon, which is also a pretty nice build. I like how they were able to replicate it in much smaller form as a micro scale build here. They also did Wu's Dragon from Possession, which we'll be taking a look at very shortly once we wrap up Lloyd. But yeah, technically these are also two different dragons, but they were for Dimensions, so they don't necessarily count as part of the mainline Ninjago sets. With that though, let's go on over and back to the other two final Lloyd Dragons. Let's go. In 2016, for the second wave of Skybound sets, which was one of the only times a single season got two waves, mostly because the Ninjago movie was delayed, we got Lloyd's Elemental Dragon, or Lloyd's Energy Dragon. And this is a really interesting one. This dragon really pushed the boundaries for what it meant to make a Ninjago dragon back in the day, and while it isn't quite as refined as some of the other creatures, it definitely was one of the most impressive dragons when it first came out. So obviously you can articulate the legs fully, which is really nice. They also recolored the joint element in transparent green, which is fantastic to see. This is one of the only sets that transparent green ratchet joint actually featured in, but super cool to see that as a particular recolor. Now, the tail is really cool in the fact that it actually has a split tail feature, so you have stud shooters at the end of the tail itself, which is a very fun feature, and you can imagine it flying through the air and blasting beams of energy out of the tails themselves. And what's really cool is the body sculpt, because this actually uses big fig arms like from Thanos or the Hulk big figs in black to make up the musculature of the front of the dragon, which is probably one of the only, if not the only time that a feature like this or this particular element was used as something other than big fig arms. I think one of the other Ninjago sets used it as logs or part of a tree trunk, but one of the only couple of times. The head itself is really exquisite and very narrow, quite an interesting design incorporating the LEGO Legends of Chima Beast Claw weapon piece, some green vines, oh that just fell off right there, but we got some green vines making up the eyelids here. I love that it actually has pupils because you have in between the transparent orange eyes, you have kind of a white inner core, and it even used the Jade Blade elements in transparent green from the Tournament of Elements season, which adds a lot of nice extra detail to the head itself. But of course, the most impressive part of this creature is the wings. And as you can see here, the wings have this beautiful metallic shine to them. And what's really cool is that you can even fold them up. I'm a little bit nervous about folding them up because I don't want to really mess around with them too much. But yeah, as you can see, they are meant to fully fold up. So if you wanted to, you could have this dragon swooping down, which is a really cool look, having this just swooping down like so. And then you can have it stop and furl out the wings just like that, and that is such a cool look. Unfortunately, they don't really look that impressive from the top. They pretty much just look like standard green pieces of cloth from the top of the dragon here, which is why this is probably one of the only dragons where it makes a lot more sense to display it from the bottom, because as you can see here, you just have this beautiful shiny metallic sculpture, metallic printing that really does capture the feel and essence of the elemental dragons themselves from the TV show. This is definitely one of my favorite Ninjago dragons just because of how cool the wings are, how interesting the building techniques were to make up the body, and just how dynamic this looks in display and especially in flight, because I really love to display this, say, swooping down and maybe attacking something down below, so you could have it set up like this, for instance, really showing off those shiny wings and having this swoop down from above, which is such a cool look for a dragon like this. So overall, one of the better looking Ninjago dragons, even if there isn't anything crazy going on with the building techniques. But moving on from 2016, just 1 year later, we finally got the LEGO Ninjago movie after it was delayed for 2 to 3 years and the entire plot was rewritten. And that gave us the Ninja Mech Dragon. So this is Lloyd's Ninja Mech Dragon from 2017, and this is also one of my favorite dragons. It's funny how a lot of my favorite dragons are the Lloyd ones, but presumably that's because a lot of effort goes into them. Now, this is a really interesting one because it is a very long creature. You do have a lot of sway in flipping the tail, and probably the only major con here is that the way that the tail is set up is, again, it can just really wrap around the body in a very awkward manner, especially if you want to pose it in flight or swooping down. You want the tail to be going like this and not like that. But it is a fun feature to flip it back and forth. Just feel like they could have added a few more stoppers there. But everything else is super fun about this dragon and very interesting. This is probably my second favorite head out of all the dragons, my favorite being the Lloyd's Legendary Dragon, because it does a very similar thing in incorporating specialized molded elements, which you can see right here. It has the front snout of the dragon as a brand new mold, as well as the bottom jaw. These pieces were only ever featured in this set, which is a bit of a shame. I kind of wish that they were able to reuse these pieces for other Ninjago dragons, but unfortunately only came in this particular one, and it's just so satisfying to open and close the jaw here. It just feels like these pieces were really meant for each other, and while the lower jaw attachment point does feel a little bit strange to me, it is made up for it by the upper head being absolutely fantastic, which is really great. Now, moving on, we actually are able to articulate the neck up and down like so. Does cause sometimes some of the spikes to come off, but for the most part, it is fairly well put together. And of course, the head itself is mounted on a ball joint, so you can really get this in all sorts of different positions, looking side to side and whatnot. Now, what's very cool about this is that it actually has jet engines on the side as well. So moving these upwards a little bit, you actually have these two jet engines which can fold outwards. So the way that they're stored is typically like this. And when you want to put it into flight mode, you just simply push these flaps outwards, and then you have rocket packs on the side of this dragon, much like the Jade Dragon from Prime Empire. The inclusion of the sand green color scheme is also really interesting to me. I love that they actually went in a completely different direction for the color scheme of this dragon compared to other Lloyd dragons. By having it be almost fully sand green really brings out a lot of unique detail, and all in all, just one of the most interesting Ninjago dragons in my opinion. Big fan of how this one turned out as a whole. Despite the fact that it doesn't even have wings, it has booster engines, but it definitely feels very reminiscent of ancient Japanese or Chinese Asian dragons who didn't really feature large wings and really were just large serpent-like creatures that soared through the sky. Moving on from the Lloyd dragons though, there are only a couple more hero dragons to take a look at, and that's when we get to Master Wu, who surprisingly has gotten 2 different dragons over the years. So, for the Master Wu dragons here, the first one that we got was for possession. It was his Elemental Dragon. This came out in 2015, and what's pretty interesting is that specifically this dragon was conceptualized as a fire dragon for Kai, but after they actually were able to do the molding for the face, the designers decided to swap the color scheme and make it a Master Wu dragon because the mustache using the Unikitty tails looked particularly wise. And so they basically just invented a reason for Wu to have his own dragon because it just looked cool, and I'm glad they did because this is probably one of the most interesting dragons when it comes to the wing building. As you can see here, they actually use the specialized Hero Factory and Bionicle G2 blade elements, or the energy blade elements, as the wings. And I think this is probably one of my favorite ways to actually brick build wings. If you're not going to do it with fabric or cloth or vinyl, which I prefer, this is probably the best way to do it because this does feel like very much like energy wings going out of the body itself, while still feeling very bulky and full rather than some of the other wings where, say, it just feels like a skeleton of wings using 3 large blades. Using a ton of smaller blades here in perfect conjunction with each other is just really satisfying to look at. Now, Wu's dragon itself is a very unique character, and it has a very unique character to it. You can see it has this kind of nougat brown coloring on the bottom here, and of course, You have this kind of curved structure, so part of the body is curved downwards and it curves upwards, and you've got two curves up here, so some nice sculpting for the body itself. But I think the best part about this dragon is the head, because just look at that head, which really screams like a wise dragon with a beard, and it has the long kind of tendrils going around the sides. Some great parts usage of the Galaxy Squad alien blasters on the sides there to kind of form some of the ridges on the sides of the head, and using croissant pieces as the ears of the dragon is a very inspired choice. So all in all, one of the most impressive dragon heads out there. This is a really fun dragon to get, and while it definitely has been outdone by some of the other dragons and more modern dragons that have come out recently, this is still one of the most classic Ninjago dragons that have come out to date. But with that, there was one more Wu dragon. Actually, in 2020, we got this for the Master of the Mountain series, and this is Wu's battle dragon. Specifically, this was not made by Wu, or actually, it's not an elemental dragon. It doesn't even belong to Wu. It is a Shintaran Ridgeback dragon, which has the ability to grow in size, but they basically just had to come up with a reason in universe as to why Wu would be using this dragon to go into battle, which is why they invented it. But yeah, so technically this belongs to Princess Vanya, but Wu used it for battle in season 13, and this is probably one of the perfect examples of what it means to make a small Ninjago dragon. Great vinyl wing elements that allow you to flap them back and forth like so, very satisfying to do so. A small head with very small and miniature details, but still absolutely gets the point across as a dragon that does belong to Wu, or is ridden by Wu. And of course, you have a ton of articulation in the legs being mounted by mixel joints and clip hinges and whatnot, so you can really bend not just the knee, but also the feet themselves, which is very satisfying to do. And the way this is built is actually pretty similar to some of the LEGO Elves creatures, which we can see right here. Elves was doing a lot of small dragons way before Ninjago was, and honestly kind of perfected the technique. So it's kind of funny only now seeing very similar building techniques as we saw in LEGO Elves be actually showcased in Ninjago, where it's just very similar in the way they're constructed. Now there is one more dragon on the quote-unquote hero side, and that is this one. So what is this dragon? Well, last year in 2021, to celebrate the 10th anniversary of LEGO Ninjago, employees who had been working for the LEGO group for a particular amount of time were given an employee Christmas set. Much like they are given a Christmas set every year, this included an exclusive build, and for the first time was featured around Ninjago to celebrate the 10th anniversary. So this is basically a reindeer dragon with a sleigh. It was made for Santa Garmadon, so I don't know, maybe this is a villain dragon, but it's just kind of funny how this was actually introduced as a model. The build for this is almost identical to Wu's dragon, right down to the way the legs are built, the way the body is built, the way the tail works, the way the wings attach. It's almost entirely the same creature. So it's pretty interesting seeing how they basically just took one set and modified it for different holiday use. If you look at the way the heads are built, they are built in almost the same exact manner. So super similar building techniques here, just a slightly different bottom jaw. And of course, this one has antlers instead of a horn on the back, but otherwise, these builds are basically very identical. So it's almost like a palette swap because they probably didn't have a ton of development effort to make this, or tried to kind of make it isolated to make it a surprise for the other LEGO employees, but still cool how we got a Ninjago Dragon for an employee gift. The wings feel very awkward to me in terms of just being very large and spindly, but obviously they couldn't come up with a new vinyl element for just an employee gift, so I understand the compromise. And having a sleigh behind it in kind of the shaping of the Destiny's Bounty is just a really fun extra add-on to boot. But with that, we have summed up the hero dragons, and it's time to take a look at the villains. Now, obviously, the villains have not gotten as many dragons as the heroes themselves, but there are quite a few to take a look at, so let's jump in right now. So I think it makes sense to start off with the main villain dragon of them all, and probably the most recent villain dragon too, and that is the Overlord Dragon. So back in 2013, we were robbed of an Overlord Dragon build. We unfortunately never got him as a set, until finally the Ninjago Legacy line gave us an Overlord Dragon for many years in the waiting in 2021. So this is a really cool looking dragon because they actually introduced a brand new dual molded head sculpt for the dragon itself, featuring rubberized golden teeth which can clamp open and shut like so right here, which is very cool. And he even has some cool detailing on the chest, which is present in the TV show itself, having the golden spines on the sides which look really cool. And all in all, this is probably one of the most impressive villain dragons we've ever gotten. Now, Unfortunately, he does try to mimic the original Golden Dragon because they are meant to be enemies, for better or for worse, because this was not one of my favorite Ninjago sets, but obviously, as you can see, they tried to make the wing design very similar to the original set. While they are mounted on ball joints this time, thankfully, which is really fantastic, I do kind of wish that they gave the Overlord Dragon some cloth elements instead. I really feel like that would have elevated this just to another level, especially given how detailed the wings were in the TV show. But overall, I think the Overlord Dragon easily wins out over the original Gold Dragon just because of how cool the color scheme is. The purples and the dark blues and the blacks and golds really all come together to striking life for this particular villainous dragon, and is one of the most visually interesting villain dragons we've gotten from Ninjago just because of how detailed it actually ended up being, despite actually being a smaller $30 set. And for $30, I think the value of this dragon is probably one of the best, which is why this is easily one of my favorite villain dragons, just because we finally got an Overlord Dragon and probably never will again for a very long time. But moving on from that, we should take a look at the first actual villain dragon from Ninjago, and this was the Nindroid Mech Dragon. So the Nindroid Mech Dragon debuted in 2014, and as you can see here, this actually did have a pretty cool feature. You could twist these back and forth to make the buzzsaws slide. It does tend to catch sometimes, but for the most part, it is a really fun feature. Not quite flapping wings, but it is pretty satisfying to actually really rev up the saws in this particular motion. It's just basically moving it alongside a large gear. Now, unfortunately, because they did have this feature included for the dragon itself, the wings cannot flap, so the wings are fixed. You can't really flap the wings or move them around. They're basically just stuck at this position, which is probably the biggest flaw with this dragon, and really illustrates that, yeah, if Ninjago designers are going to give a villain dragon a special type of character or a special type of action feature, then they probably won't allow you to flap the wings. And obviously this is so kids won't break the function or will be able to easily use the function without the wings flapping at the same time. But I feel like for something like this, they could have easily integrated both flapping wings and the function, so that's a bit of a disappointment. The head itself, while simple, absolutely gets the point across. It's a really fun design with the striking red eyes for the Robotic Dragon, and this was the first fully robotic dragon we ever got, complete with a jail cell that actually sits right in the center of the chest here. This is actually a full-on jail cell to hold Lloyd, just like in the TV show, so you can plop him in the jail cell, close it up. There are also detachable flyers for Nindroids, so the sides of these actually open up and these become flying suits for the Nindroids to mount on their backs. So all sorts of really cool things that you can do with this dragon that really does feel like it is a troop carrier and kind of like a large mothership for the Nindroids. So that is all very, very impressive and nice. And what's very cool about this dragon is that it also has an Exoforce Easter egg. If you look here, there's a reference to Sentai Mountain from LEGO Exoforce, which was the very first LEGO mech line. You can actually see all the Exoforce sets over there, and it's really cool when LEGO still references their older themes in sets like this, which came out in 2014. Moving on from the Nindroid Mech Dragon, though, I think it's time we take a look at the next set of villainous dragons. Jumping forwards to 2015, we have the Morrow Dragon. So this is Morrow's Dragon of Wind, which is a really interesting one, incorporating the LEGO Disney Pixar Cars bonnet as the front of the head there. And all in all, this has quite the unique design to it. As you can see, when I move one of the wings up, it really does feel reminiscent of a coiled serpent, using these very large curved pieces to evoke that coiled feel, which is certainly very interesting. I also am a big fan of the way the wings turned out. These cloth pieces look fantastic, and I think this really demonstrates that if they had the opportunity to make a new cloth piece, it almost always is going to be better than any brick build option. Maybe the Wu's Battle Dragon is probably the closest to being good, but this cloth just kind of blows away all of the other options out of the water and just looks really satisfying on display to actually have these very large cloth wings. Now, the legs themselves can be moved back and forth. Unfortunately, this is not glow in the dark. It is just spring yellowish green. I know that they are experimenting with making the dragon glow in the dark, but it just didn't turn out because it just looked more white rather than green. So this was the best compromise they could do. But all in all, this is probably one of the best villain dragons. Actually, looking at them, I would say the second best villain dragon they ever made, and it is a very, very close competition with the dragons here. So all in all, definitely one of the most impressive dragons they made. But alongside the Morrow Dragon in 2015, we got a ton of other ghost dragons, and I'll go from smallest or largest to smallest. So This one right here was a dragon that was a side build for the final flight of the Destiny's Bounty set. I actually really like this one because it uses these specialized LEGO Legends of Chima dual molded blade elements that were introduced for the Fire Chi, but obviously it uses these elements dual molded in the dark blue and spring yellow screen as the wings. And again, despite these not actually being cloth, I think they work out pretty well. The way the wings are mounted, though, is very, very strange because they are mounted on a Bionicle Gatorian neck piece, which means that the upper wings kind of are mounted higher than they typically are. So flapping the wings just feels a little bit weird to me, just feels like they're mounted way too high. I think it would have made more sense if they just put a ball joint on this end. Then you could flap the wings like this. I think that works a lot better than having it be mounted so high, but maybe that was what they were going for the look and feel of this dragon. Now, the brick-built head itself is another really fun one and really makes the most out of using just a few pieces. This is probably one of the other really impressive brick-built heads, especially at a small scale. Love the way this came together. And I also appreciate the usage of CCBS Bionicle elements, which you can see right here. These are literally just LEGO Bionicle Hero Factory CCBS joints, which blend in perfectly well with a dragon like this and allow you to have the full range of posability that you would want. You also can pivot the body, so that's a plus as well. Moving on from this dragon, though, we have even more little dragons. Now, for possession, we got 3 more small dragons. Let's kind of get these all set up here. And one of them, again, uses these specialized Chima pieces, which is quite cool to see, and uses a larger head, but just was a side build for the other vehicles. We've also got 2 little ones. I believe one of these was a polybag. Don't know which one it was. Maybe this one, or maybe I don't even have the polybag with me, but all of these were pretty much just side builds for the other sets, which was pretty cool having an entire faction use dragons, even though they didn't really feature in the TV show pretty much at all. So that was a bit of a shame. We got them in, I guess, the final episode in the background, but they didn't really show up as actual threats. But still interesting to see so many different dragons. And lastly, for the Possession faction, just last year in 2021, we got a Legacy Possession set that was for 4+, so this was kind of just your basic Possession dragon, but I really actually kind of like the feature here because it's just very, very simple. It's a vinyl element. Hold it here, put your thumb or finger here, you press down, and it looks like the wings are flapping, and that actually feels pretty organic to me. I actually really like how this works. So just feels like a tiny dragon to complement the army, and the printing on that is quite good as well. Moving on from these, though, there are a couple of newer LEGO Ninjago villain dragons. We have only gotten 2 for this newer era of Ninjago, but the first one here is the Empire Dragon. So this is the dragon form of Unagami when he can actually transform in-game to a ferocious dragon. Part of probably the coolest dragon fight scene we have ever gotten in Ninjago yet, having just 2 dragons battling it out. This is meant to battle against Jade's Lightning Dragon from the Prime Empire waves, so just a very cool looking design. I like the very angular blades making up the back of the legs here. Using skis for minifigures as toes is a really inspired choice. And again, the headpiece for this is quite good as well. While it is fairly simple and just uses a 2x2 block with printing on it for the eyes here, I think it's just done really well and feels very menacing as a villain dragon. Not to mention the color scheme being black, teal, and gray is one of the cooler dragon color schemes that we've gotten so far. But moving on from the Empire Dragon, which was just another smaller dragon, we can take a look at what, in my opinion, is the best Ninjago villain dragon we have ever gotten, and that is Griefbringer right here. So this is the Griefbringer dragon, ridden by Skull Sorcerer and Hazadur before him, and as you can see, this is easily the largest and most intricate villain dragon we have ever gotten, which really honestly outshines many of the hero dragons. So this is basically an undead dragon which has been brought back to life, so it's a dragon skeleton which has been reanimated, which is such a cool look. Ironically, one of the only times where actually making the wings be skeletal would have made sense. They chose to go with a cloth element, but hey, I am not complaining because this cloth element looks fantastic. I think it fits the undead vibe of this dragon perfectly. Just kind of funny how the one time they actually had an excuse to use skeletal wings, they did not. And just look at the way the head is constructed here. This is just done really well with all sorts of bony detail making up the sides of the head. You've got spikes sticking out of all corners of it, sharp teeth, and you have all sorts of different bones here. So just a really cool head sculpt in general, despite again just using the standard 2x2 block printed on either side. It's a very, very impressive head sculpting. Now, onto here, there actually is a function as well. If you press down on levers on the back, the rib cage does open up and the dragon can spill its guts out and cause it to actually land on people as bombs. That is a really cool and metal feature that is very reminiscent of the Bionicle Tridax pods, if you're aware of the 2008 Fantoka Bionicle sets, but pretty cool feature to see there. Would have been nice to have a wing flapping feature because this just feels like it was made for flapping wings, but I also appreciate how they didn't do it because now, because the wings are mounted on ball joints, you can get them in all sorts of different positions and really just angle them in particular ways that you want. Now, the only con here, again, much like many of the other dragons, is the tail is just mounted on the frictionless joint system here. Despite coming out in 2021, they were still using this standard kind of frictionless tail, which means that if you put it on the ground, the tail is very likely to just curl upwards like this. And that doesn't look very menacing to me. It kind of just looks very awkward having it be fully curled around. I wish there was a way to keep it straight, but typically, unless you're like really paying attention, things will tend to sway one way or the other, especially if you're hanging it on display. But besides that, this is easily one of the coolest villain dragons. You cannot move the front legs, which is a shame, but you can bend them at the knee, so that's really all the articulation you need. I appreciate that they actually allow you to do this. If they just had the legs be fully fixed, that would be a big con, but since you can do this, that's not a big deal, because this looks like it's flying just fine. And overall, I love the detail on this model, and I think it's a great one to wrap up all of the Ninjago Dragons. Because with Griefbringer here, we've summed up every single one of them. Now, I am really curious, what are your favorite dragons? And let me know in the comments below, what do you think of all of the Ninjago dragons together? Obviously, they're all a little bit disorganized right now. They're all kind of strewn about, but we have so many different types of dragons, some different models of the same dragon, like Kai's Fire Dragon. These three dragons are representing the same one. So LEGO just trying different things at different points in history. And I'm kind of curious myself, what would make the best dragon? Because I feel like we haven't quite gotten the best dragon yet. Now, Lloyd's Legendary Dragon comes close, and the wing flapping function is neat, but you can't actually adjust the wings on ball joints, so that is a bit of a con to me. I also do like the function though, so I kind of wish they were able to incorporate this function, but with ball joints as well. That would pretty much make this perfect because it has a great head sculpt, it's got articulation on the legs, it's got a tail that you can actually pose with mixel joints instead of with the frictionless joints, and other dragons do also come close, but I always feel like there is something missing preventing them from being perfect. Although, you could combine different aspects of different dragons and basically make the perfect dragon that way. Take the head of this dragon and the legs, take the tail of another dragon, take the wings of a different one. You have the potential of making probably the best dragon you could ever do. So I'm really curious, what will LEGO do with Ninjago dragons in the future? Obviously, this particular era of Ninjago is ending with Ninjago Crystallized, which is coming out very, very soon, if it hasn't already at the time this video comes out. Now, next year, for the first half of the year, we are getting Ninjago Core, so it will be our main 6 heroes, but nothing related to the TV show. This is just kind of generic adventures, and getting a massive ice dragon, so very, very excited for that. But going forwards, there is a brand new series on the way. It is in probably a completely different time period with different characters. Ninjago United is the temporary name for it, or kind of the rumored name. I don't know what they're going to do there. Obviously, there will be more dragons, but we may actually see different elements. I don't know if they're going to stick to the main elements or do more stuff. The future is very exciting for Ninjago because we've gotten a lot of dragons in different groupings. We've gotten a lot of fire ones, lightning, a few water ones, ice, earth, and green/energy. A couple of villain ones scattered here and there, but I would love to see more elements, more out there designs, and wacky concepts for Ninjago dragons, and really the future is very bright for the rest of Ninjago. And with that, I think we have summed up every single LEGO Ninjago Dragon set ever made. Alright, and with that, we have summed up all of the LEGO Ninjago Dragons across the theme's now 11-year plus run. I was so happy to be able to showcase all of these dragons for you, and do let me know down in the comments below which ones are your favorites. Do you have a favorite dragon? Do you have a favorite type of dragon? Do you like the molded heads, or do you like the more brick-built heads? Or do you like kind of what they're doing today, which is a combination between being brick-built and molded? All in all, I cannot wait to see what Ninjago has in store for the rest of the sets. Of course, next year, we are getting a brand new era of Ninjago. We are getting a fully new TV series, so that is featuring probably all new characters, a whole new storyline, but Ninjago will still remain as a staple in LEGO's history, and I can't wait to see because I'm sure this is just the beginning of more amazing LEGO Dragons from Ninjago. With that, we have summed up this video. Thank you so much for tuning in. Stay tuned to Duckbricks for even more LEGO news, reviews, discussion, and analyses coming your way very soon. Thanks, and bye-bye for now.